Good evening. Thank you again for studying the Bible with me. Go ahead and grab your Bible. Be turning over to Matthew chapter 6. We've been looking at Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7 in what is known as the Sermon on the Mount and what we've been calling the greatest sermon ever recorded. We've already gone through chapter 5, about half of chapter 6. And you'll remember chapter 6 last week where we started off how Jesus was telling us about three different things that the followers of his might participate in. Great things, wonderful things. You'll remember those three things as giving, as praying, and as fasting. And what was the main point in Jesus bringing up these three wonderful things that a follower of his might do? Well, he was saying don't do it for the benefit of other individuals looking at you and building you up for your benefit. Instead, do them in secret. And the Father who sees you doing it in secret will reward you. That was the whole point in him bringing up those 3 points. Now, you'll remember how we finished off our class last week in verses 19 through 21, which talks about two different treasures. And you'll remember the approach that we took. We took maybe a little bit different approach than we usually do. And that is looking at maybe a treasure that we try to build up in our life of prestige and worth. And if I can be a good person so other individuals can see me, well then that can be my treasure. Well, that of course, that treasure is temporary. That treasure is not eternal. Instead, let's go ahead and build up a treasure of following God and doing all these good things for his benefit and for the benefit of the kingdom. That's the approach we took last week. I want us to revisit verses 19 and following as we go into our next context, and we're going to finish out this chapter, chapter 6. And I want us to look at it at the approach that usually we take whenever we read this, and that has to do with wealth, and that has to do with money. Now in this particular passage, in this particular section, Jesus is going to use a lot of doubles. He's going to use a lot of twos. And he's going to do this several different ways, several different times. So let's go ahead and look at the first one, and that is two types of treasure. Read along with me verses 19 through 21. 19 through 21 says this: "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." We see two different types of treasures. The first one, of course, is obviously earthly treasures. You know, we can work hard and we can receive and we can be given many different earthly treasures. And those earthly treasures have some great benefits, don't they? Great benefits here on this earth. But what's Jesus trying to point out? They're temporal. They're temporary. They're moth-eaten eventually. They run out. They get outdated. They might get stolen. They're no good for you for all of eternity. You need to base your treasure upon something else, and that second treasure is, of course, heavenly treasure. What if you decided, instead of just spending all of your time trying to build this wealth for yourself in your life, what if you spent a lot more time working on the rewards that Jesus talked about in the early portions of this chapter? What if you spent a lot more time giving or praying or even fasting? What if you tried to be an individual who followed so many of the other things that he talked about in chapter 5? What if you devoted your time to growing closer to God, growing closer to his church, and trying to bring other individuals to that church? What if that was your treasure? Well, if that was your treasure, if God is your treasure, well, this treasure is eternal, because you'll be spending all of eternity with him. You'll be spending all of eternity with individuals that as well are going to follow him also. This is a wonderful thing. Where is your heart is what Jesus is getting at right here. Where your heart is, or where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Where is your heart? You can find it in what you deem as very, very important, valuable to you. Where is your treasure? If you find your treasure, that's where you will find your heart. There's another two, and that is two types of eyes. Read with me verses 22 and 23. 22 and 23 says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Now, Jesus is going to separate two types of eyes. What's the significance of an eye? Well, an eye is what you see things with. You're able to focus on different items with your eye. So could it be that Jesus is saying that he's not really talking about your physical eye? He's talking, of course, about something else. He's talking about, what are you focusing on? What are you focusing on? What are you fixated on with what you see, but also with what you run to in your life? Could it be that Jesus is saying what you are focused on is who you are? Who are you? Just like earlier on, where is your heart? Find the treasure and you'll find your heart. Who are you? Well, what are you focused on? What are you viewing? What are you looking at as important in your life? Did you notice how Jesus says that your eye is the lamp of your body? What you focus on is who you are and what people see. Do you remember back in Matthew chapter 5, earlier on in this Sermon on the Mount, how Jesus said that you are the light of the world? You're the light of the world. When people see you, they should be seeing Jesus Christ. They should be seeing Jesus' life in action. They should be seeing the gospel through you. So, if your eye is the lamp of your life, if your eye is the lamp of who you are, meaning your focus is who you are, well, individuals should be able to see you, and they should be able to see the proper focus. They should be able to see Jesus. Now, let's go back to the two eyes. What does he say there in verse 22? If the eye is clear, if you're focused on Jesus, if you're focused on God in your life, if you know where your treasure stands, you know that it's not in this material wealth that we might be able to receive here on this earth, but rather it's in God, it's in heaven, it's in the spiritual blessings that he's able to give you. If you know this, then your focus, your vision is clear. And if it is clear, well, individuals can follow you. You can be of benefit not only to yourself, but also to others, because you are that light to the world. And individuals can look at you and go, hey, he or she knows where they're going. They know the path to heaven. They know the path to salvation. I'm going to follow them because clearly they have their eye correct. They have their focus correct. But verse 23 talks about if your eye is bad. Well, if your eye is bad, could it be that you are focused, your life is focused on nothing but material gain? And that defines you. That material gain defines you, and you may not be able to help people because you're not thinking necessarily about spiritual things. You're not thinking in a way to help individuals because you're simply thinking about yourself. Is your eye clear or is your eye bad? It's going to determine what's good for you or what's good for others as well. It becomes who you are. So, there's the two treasures. There's the two eyes. Let's look at another one. Two types of masters. Look with me at verse 24. Verse 24 says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Well, he's finishing out kind of the thoughts right here that we are accustomed to thinking about whenever he's equating the spiritual life and the material life. But here he talks about two masters. Who are those two masters? There's God, of course. We should want to serve him. We should want to follow him. We should want him to be our master. And if my treasure is in him, and if I'm focusing on him, he is my master. And I will follow him. And I will do as he asks me to do. And I will try to help others find him also. Or my master might be my wealth. It might be my riches. And you know, we think about riches, we think about wealth. We're so blessed. We're so blessed here in America. And later on in our class this evening, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about riches, and riches and wealth is not the bad thing. Riches and wealth is not bad in and of themselves, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in the next few minutes. But right now, who is in charge of you? Is it God? Or is it your own work? Is it your own wealth? Is it your own ambitions? Is it your own strivings? And Jesus says right here, you can't serve them both, because you'll hate one and you'll serve another. You'll love another. You need to pick one. You need to find one, and you need to follow that master right here. A good question that we might need to ask ourselves is, when people see you, what do they think? And I realize you can't determine what's in their mind, but maybe you have a good idea by just what people say to you, the way they treat you. But when people see you, what do they think? Do they think about your occupation? Do they think about your wealth, or maybe the lack of wealth that you have? Do they think about your status? Or do they think he or she is a follower of Christ? Clearly, they have a master in heaven. They may not necessarily of Christ. Can they see a follower of God? I want to continue with this thought process of twos. Now, in this particular section, 19 through 24, there is those three times that two different examples are made. Jesus is done with that, but I kind of want to keep that, because I think if we keep that understanding, it's going to continue on through this particular passage. What I want us to talk about is two motivations. Two motivations, and those two motivations are two motivations for allowing the material to trump the eternal, because that's what Jesus has been talking about right here. He's been talking about allowing the material world around you to be more important to you than the spiritual world. So what are two motivations that might cause you to be that man or that woman who's searching after just material things instead of spiritual things? Here's the first thing. The first motivation: luxury. Wanting to live that luxurious life. And we've already read these passages right here. We're not going to read them again, verses 19 through 24, the verses that we just read. I really believe Jesus is talking right here about individuals who want luxury, who find luxury as the most important thing in their life. They want the material goods. They want the material wealth, and that is what defines them, because that's what they're seeking, and that's all that they're seeking. I want us to move away from Matthew chapter 6 for just a second. This type of an individual is not painted in a good light at all. James chapter 5, starting in verse 1. James chapter 5, starting in verse 1 says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." Verse 5, "You have lived luxuriously on the earth, and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He paints a negative picture on the individual whose life is determined by getting wealthier, by living in luxury, by being as rich as he or she possibly can. And the point James is bringing out is that there's even a understanding that some individuals who do this, they are so fixated on getting rich and getting wealthy that they don't care about others. And they're going to hurt others. They're going to cheat out others in order to get richer and richer. Well, this, of course, is a terrible thing. And obviously, these individuals are those who have put wealth far above God. This is a motivation. But I want you to go over to 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, because you'll remember I brought up earlier, we're rich here in America, aren't we? We have a lot of blessings. We are so blessed. So if you're rich and if you're living in what most of the world would consider luxury, are you sinning? We've got to touch on this just a little bit. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 17. Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Well, I don't see in this passage right here that the individual who is rich is condemned. No, God will bless certain individuals. Some individuals are going to have this luxury, is going to have blessings, is going to have wonderful wealth, and most of us in America are far richer than many people around the world. Does that mean that we're bad? Does that mean that our master is our money instead of God? No, not necessarily. Paul is saying right here to Timothy, instruct those who have been blessed, who have that luxury. Make sure you help others. Make sure that that is not who you lay your treasure in or what you lay your treasure in. Instead, your treasure needs to be found in God. Be generous, give to others. But again, the wealth is not the issue. The wealth So, going back to Jesus' thoughts in Matthew chapter 6, the first motivation for pushing me to want to follow my wealth instead of following God might be luxury. Let that never be the case. But here's a second point, and it's one that we don't really think of or one that we usually associate with wanting to get wealthy and the motivation for wanting to get wealthy. And that is, number 2, anxiety. Do I ever allow the motivation of anxiety to push me to want or to push me to follow my wealth and follow my treasure instead of following God? Let's go back over to chapter 6. Chapter 6, and I want to read several verses here, starting in verse 25. Starting in verse 25, it says this: For this reason I say to you, chapter 6, verse 25 and following, for this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life, as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? Verse 27, and who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, verse 30, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Verse 31. Do not worry then, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? Verse 32 says, for the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. Verse 33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Finally, verse 34, so do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. All right, so second motivation possibly for causing me to put material above the spiritual: anxiety, being anxious for something, being scared, being allowed the fears of the world to dictate who I am. Notice what he says there in verse 25. for this reason. Jesus is still talking in the same context as we've already been reading verses 19 through 24. Now as we get into anxiety, he's talking about the same thing. For this reason, don't be anxious. Do not be worried. Could it be that those who do not have money, could it be that those who do not have money, who do not have the luxuries of life, that sometimes they value earthly and temporal and material treasures higher than even those who actually have those items have? Could it be that those who do not have riches sometimes have more of a god, more of an idol in riches than those who are actually rich? It could be. Because sometimes what you don't have, you want desperately, and you're scared about, and you're anxious about, why don't I have what I need and what I want? What good can being anxious be for you? What good can anxiety do for you? And Jesus is saying it is no good for you. It's terrible for you. Don't be anxious for these things. How on earth can anxiety feed you or clothe you? And then he brings up the birds. The birds, well, they're fed. The flowers, they're clothed. So what about you? Aren't you worth much more than birds and flowers? And God is able to take care of you because he loves you. Don't let the world's earthly treasures become your idol, become your treasure. Don't let that happen to you, because if you do, then you're following those things. Even if you don't have those things, you're allowing it to become God to you. Did you notice what he said there in verse 30? He said in verse 30, you of little faith. You have little faith. Jesus said this a couple times, and I find it interesting that he would say it to individuals who were following him. He said it here at the Sermon on the Mount to individuals who are clearly following him, clearly wanting to learn a lot about him, clearly wanting to do what is right. And he's telling them, if this is who you are, you've got little faith. Where else did he say this? Do you remember when Jesus fell asleep in the boat and the winds and the waves were crashing? And in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 26, they had finally woke him up. Hey, we're perishing. And what did he say? Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? Or what about in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 31? Jesus is now walking on the water. Jesus is walking on the water. Peter looks out, sees Jesus on the water on this dark night where there was winds and there was waves. And Peter told Jesus, hey, call me out on the water. And Jesus called him out on the water. And what did he do? He started walking on the water. Why? Because he had his eye fixed on Jesus. But whenever he took his eye off of Jesus and he started looking at the wind and he started looking at the dark waves below him, what happened? He started to sink. Jesus reached down, picked him up, and what did Jesus say? You of little faith, why did you doubt? One more. Jesus also said later on, and I didn't write it down in my notes, I forget where this is, it's also in Matthew, but Jesus is talking about, he's telling his disciples, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And here are the disciples scratching their heads going, what is he talking about? What is he talking about? Well, we don't have bread with us. Maybe he wants us to find bread. We don't have bread. And Jesus is shaking his head and saying, don't you remember? I've taken just a few loaves several times and I've made huge feasts out of them. And what does he say? You men of little faith. Sometimes we can be people of little faith as well. And it happens whenever we are in need or whenever we feel like we're in need. And whenever we start to put the world's treasures and the world's what we think as needs before God, sometimes we lose faith. Sometimes we become individuals of little faith. Sometimes we've been blessed so much, and the first time something bad happens to us, we start to become those people of little faith, and it comes through in our attitude. Don't let this happen. Don't be that type of a person. So, all people All people need to ask, whether you're rich or whether you're poor, whether you're somewhere in the middle, all people need to ask these three questions. Where is my treasure? Where is my treasure? What do I find as that which is important in my life? And remember, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Number two, where is my eye? Am I focusing on Jesus? Am I the first part of Peter whenever I'm down there on the water and I'm looking at Jesus and I'm walking across the water? Or am I the part of Peter that takes my eye off of him and starts to sink? Where is my eye? Am I fixing my gaze? Am I fixing my faith in riches or in God? And then finally, who is my master? Is my master myself? Am I the master of my soul and all the money and prestige that I can gain and build myself? Or is the Lord my master? The one who gives me all that I could ever want or need for all of eternity. What a fantastic chapter. What a fantastic chapter that really steps on my toes quite a bit. Steps on my toes. A chapter that will push us to be better men and women for Christ. Again, I want to finish out with verse 33. Verse 33 again, we've already read it, but read it along with me again. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Don't worry. Don't worry about the prestige that we might be trying to worry about, like we saw in the early portions of chapter 6. Don't worry about money, whether you've got it or whether you don't. Don't let that be the thing that drives you. Instead, let his righteousness, let his kingdom be that which drives you, motivates you, pushes you to be a better person. Thank you for studying the Bible with me tonight.